Under a sun that seemed too calm for what was about to unfold, a lone fighter cut through the thin morning haze above the Italian countryside, its engine coughing unevenly, its pilot drenched in sweat, his hands trembling not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of a decision he knew could end his career or save hundreds of lives. The air smelled of burning oil and cordite, and far below, the scarred earth of 1944 Europe stretched like a battlefield without end. At that moment, Captain Charles Buster Hall didn't know he was about to rewrite the rules of aerial warfare. He only knew he could no longer follow orders that were getting his men killed. It was May 5, 1944. The 392nd Fighter Group, better known as the Tuskegee Airmen, had just been assigned bomber escort duty over Ploiești, Romania, one of the most heavily defended oil refineries in the German war machine. Hall, 28 years old, from Mobile, Alabama, sat inside his P-51B Mustang named Duchess of the Sky. He had painted her himself with careful strokes, each one a rebellion against the invisibility the world had tried to impose on him. The red tail gleamed in the pale dawn light, its color a mark of distinction among men who fought two wars at once, one against the Luftwaffe and one against the disbelief of their own country. For months, his squadron had been ordered to stick to the bombers, no matter what. Those words, drilled into every red tail pilot, were meant to ensure discipline and protection for the lumbering B-17s that carried America's strategic hope across Europe. But Hall had watched too many of his friends die under that doctrine. Pilots forced to watch enemy interceptors form deadly slashing attacks, unable to break formation to defend themselves or take the initiative. The sky had become a graveyard of restraint. On that particular mission, as the sun climbed over the Adriatic, Hall's flight of 4 P-51s took up their escort position along the outer flank of the bomber stream, engines droning in synchronized fatigue. The radio crackled with static and short, clipped orders. Stay with them, Red Flight. No chasing. The voice of Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. was calm, iron-willed, and absolute. Hall respected him deeply, but respect did not silence the ache in his chest every time another bomber fell in flames because he wasn't allowed to intercept the threat before it struck. The Luftwaffe came just after 0830 hours. A wave of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s diving out of the sun, using blinding glare as camouflage. Hall saw the formation scatter and reorganize into a coordinated pincer, designed to split the American escort. He tightened his jaw. They were coming fast, closing from 2 o'clock high, maybe a dozen of them. The bombers held their course, slow and vulnerable, their defensive guns spitting tracers that did little to stop the descending predators. Hall's instincts screamed. He had seconds to decide. Hold position, Red Flight. The order came again through the radio. But Hall was already rolling left, breaking formation. His wingman shouted in confusion. Buster, what are you doing? Hall didn't answer. The Mustang shuddered under the sudden G-force as he dropped beneath the bomber line, leveling out directly in the path of the oncoming Germans. He was disobeying a direct order. He knew it, but he also knew what was coming next. A slaughter, unless someone stopped it. He leveled out just as the first German came into range. The sun flashed off the enemy's canopy. Hall squeezed the trigger. The Mustang's 6 .50 caliber Browning machine guns roared, their vibration shaking the cockpit like a living beast. The first 109 exploded in mid-air, scattering fragments that cut across Hall's canopy with metallic pings. He rolled again, snapping the Mustang into a tight climbing turn, shooting through the debris cloud. Another fighter overshot, and Hall kicked the rudder, firing in a sharp burst that tore the enemy's engine apart. Within 30 seconds, 2 Luftwaffe fighters were down. The radio erupted with overlapping voices, confusion, anger, disbelief. Red 3, get back in formation. But Hall was already diving again, targeting the second German element before it reached the bombers. He pushed the throttle to full military power, the Merlin engine howling as if in defiance. The airspeed indicator danced past 400 miles per hour. He could see the German pilots ahead, their formation unraveling as they realized one American fighter was charging them head-on against all logic. They broke apart, too late. Hall fired through the gap, hitting another plane squarely in the fuselage. Smoke and fire spiraled downward, tracing a black scar against the blue. When the sky finally cleared, Hall had shot down 4 aircraft. Alone. The bombers continued almost unscathed to their targets, their crews later reporting that it was the first time they hadn't taken heavy losses over Ploiești. But in the radio silence that followed, Hall knew what was coming. He had disobeyed orders. And in wartime, disobedience could end a career, even one that had just saved a dozen bombers and their 60 men. He landed back at Ramatelli airfield in southern Italy just after noon, his plane streaked with smoke and carbon scoring. The ground crew rushed to him, their faces lit with disbelief as they counted the bullet holes across the fuselage, more than 60. Hall climbed down slowly, his legs numb from exhaustion. Captain Wendell Pruitt met him by the wing, eyes wide. "You broke formation," Pruitt said, not accusingly, just stating the fact. Hall nodded once. "Yeah, but they didn't break us." Word spread quickly. By evening, the entire base was whispering about what he had done. The official report was filed, the kill count verified. Colonel Davis called him into his office, the air thick with tension. Davis sat behind the desk, hands folded, eyes sharp. "You know what you did," he said quietly. Hall stood at attention, sweat still glistening on his neck. "Yes, sir." Davis let the silence stretch before finally saying, "If you had failed, they'd be court-martialing you right now. But you didn't fail, did you?" Hall said nothing. Davis exhaled slowly. "You saved those bombers, Captain. But you've also started something I can't stop." Within days, Hall's actions were being discussed across the Mediterranean theater. Other squadrons began to adjust, unofficially, allowing their pilots more freedom to engage threats dynamically rather than in rigid formation. A quiet revolution was underway. The doctrine of "stay with the bombers" began to crumble, replaced by fluid, aggressive escort tactics that would define the final year of air combat in Europe. Hall's disobedience, once seen as reckless, was being studied as a model. But not everyone celebrated him. Official commendation was delayed, buried under bureaucratic discomfort. Hall's after-action report was filed under tactical deviation, exceptional outcome. He was not given the Distinguished Flying Cross until years later. The color of his skin, the controversy of his choice, both made his heroism inconvenient. Still, in the skies over Europe, pilots began flying differently. Escort formations started using disruption flights, where pairs of fighters broke away briefly to intercept before returning. Loss rates among bombers dropped by nearly 30%. The Luftwaffe, caught off guard by this new aggression, was forced to alter its interception strategies, spreading thinner, losing initiative. It was a small tactical shift, born from one man's refusal to obey a bad order, that changed the air war's rhythm entirely. Hall continued flying until the end of the war. He led missions over Austria and southern Germany, always pushing the edge of what was permitted, earning the quiet respect of his men. But when he returned home in 1945, he was not greeted as a hero. The country he had fought for still saw him first as a black man. He went back to Alabama, took a job as a flight instructor, and rarely spoke of the day he had turned the sky upside down. It wasn't until decades later, when declassified reports revealed the shift in air combat doctrine, that historians began to trace it back to that morning over Ploiești, when Captain Charles Hall decided that obedience could be deadlier than the enemy. He died in 1971 at 55, never knowing that modern air combat, from Vietnam to the Persian Gulf, would be built on principles that his single act of defiance had inspired. He had broken the rules, yes, but in doing so, he had broken the pattern of defeat. And somewhere high above the Italian fields, perhaps the wind still carries the echo of a P-51 engine, roaring not in rebellion, but in the sound of freedom redefining itself. The nights after that mission were restless for Hall. The airfield at Ramatelli grew quieter once the engines died down, but his mind never stopped circling back to the moment he had pulled that trigger, the sound of his Merlin engine roaring like a caged animal finally released. He had done what every instinct told him was right, and yet each time he replayed it, the weight of the word disobedience pressed on him like an invisible hand around his throat. The Tuskegee Airmen had spent years proving they were as disciplined, as precise, as obedient as any white squadron in the Army Air Forces, perhaps more so. Their entire existence rested on the belief that if they flew perfectly by the book, the system that doubted them might finally believe. And now Hall had broken that very foundation. In the dim light of the officers' quarters, he sat on his cot, flight jacket still on, boots half unlaced, listening to the distant sound of the Adriatic surf. His bunkmate, Lieutenant Edward Ace McDaniels, a tall, calm man from Kansas City, rolled over and said softly, "You know they're gonna come for you, Buster." Hall didn't respond. McDaniels sighed. "I mean it. Davis is fighting for us with every scrap of credibility he's got. They can't afford one of us going rogue." Hall's eyes stayed fixed on the ceiling. "Maybe," he murmured. "But if following orders means dying in perfect formation, I'd rather be court-martialed alive than honored dead." That line would later be quoted, though no one would know who first said it, in the unofficial manuals circulated among pilots after the war. But at that moment, it was just a man talking to himself, trying to justify the ghosts that followed him. 2 days later, the next mission order came down from headquarters. Target, Linz. Heavy industrial complex. Escort formation same as before. Hall felt his pulse quicken when he read the directive attached. All escort pilots are to maintain assigned positions. Deviation without direct command authorization remains subject to disciplinary review. It was a message written for him, thinly veiled, deliberate. Yet when he walked out to Duchess of the Sky that morning, something in him felt different. The fear of punishment had dulled, replaced by a deeper conviction that he had seen what worked, and the sky itself had validated him. Takeoff was smooth. The 4 red-tailed Mustangs lifted in perfect unison, sunlight glinting off their canopies. At 10,000 feet, condensation traced soft lines along their wings, the air cold and biting. Hall's oxygen mask pressed tight against his face, and for a while, everything seemed ordinary, until the radar controller's voice crackled in his headset. "Enemy bandits, 30 miles north-northeast, altitude 22,000. The B-17s below adjusted their formation slightly, their silver bodies flashing against the clouds." Hall's eyes scanned the horizon. He could sense them before he saw them, the faint black specks growing rapidly larger, slicing down through the blue. "Red Flight, prepare for contact," Davis's voice came over the radio. "Stay close. Do not break." Hall swallowed hard. His hands flexed on the stick. His squadron was flying at 25,000 now, the bombers just below them. The Germans were coming fast, FW-190s again, maybe 16 of them. They were using a new tactic, learned from the previous defeat, diving through the escort line and climbing beneath the bombers, exploiting the blind spot in the belly defense. Hall understood it immediately. It was smart and deadly. The first tracers ripped through the lower ranks of bombers, slicing into one's right wing. Smoke and fire erupted, the radio filled with screaming voices. "Mayday! Mayday! Engine 3 hit!" Hall's muscles tightened. He saw the wounded B-17 trailing behind, its crew bailing out. Then another 190 lined up, preparing to strike. "Red 2, go down there!" Davis ordered. "Keep formation!" But Hall had already pushed his throttle forward. He was diving again. "Buster, not again!" McDaniels shouted, but it was too late. The G-force slammed Hall into his seat as the P-51 dropped in a near-vertical dive, his vision blurred at the edges. He felt his body compress under the acceleration. The altimeter spun down. 22,000, 20, 19. He leveled out behind the enemy just as the German broke into a climb. Hall's hands steadied. One burst, controlled, precise, and the enemy exploded in a sphere of flame that faded into drifting smoke. He didn't climb back to formation this time. Instead, he stayed low, weaving between the bomber columns, intercepting every enemy plane that tried to exploit the blind spot. It was improvisation, chaotic, instinctive, brilliant, and it worked. By the time the group reached Linz, all remaining German fighters had withdrawn. The B-17 crews reported minimal losses. Hall's tactics, now clearly more than luck, had once again defied the book. That evening, Davis called a closed meeting in the operations tent. The air was tense with unspoken conflict. Hall stood rigidly before his commanding officer, the smell of aviation fuel still clinging to his flight suit. Davis's face was unreadable. "Captain Hall," he began, "do you know what kind of storm you're creating?" Hall looked straight ahead. "Yes, sir." "A necessary one," Davis exhaled through his nose. "You think because it worked twice, you can rewrite doctrine overnight?" Hall's jaw tightened. "I'm not rewriting it, sir. I'm surviving it. The silence that followed was heavy enough to suffocate. Then Davis leaned back in his chair, his tone quieter. "I read your reports. You've identified something I hadn't considered. Maybe discipline isn't just about obedience. Maybe it's about knowing when the mission needs you to think." He paused, eyes narrowing. "But if command hears I said that, they'll have my head. So officially, you are reprimanded. Unofficially," he extended his hand slightly. "Keep flying how you fly, but don't you ever make me regret this." That handshake, small, secret, became the pivot point of a revolution. Davis, known for his iron control, had just given silent permission for a change he could never publicly endorse. From that moment on, the Red Tails began experimenting in small, quiet ways. Pairs of fighters practiced breaking formation for quick intercepts, using fluid maneuvers to confuse the enemy and rejoin the bombers before command even realized they were gone. The tactics evolved mission by mission, like jazz, structured yet free, disciplined yet alive. By summer 1944, the results were undeniable. Losses among bombers under Tuskegee escort fell to historic lows. Hall's name, though rarely spoken in briefings, was whispered with a kind of awe among air crews. Pilots began calling his style the Buster Weave, a pattern of unpredictable interlocking defensive turns that forced German fighters to miscalculate attack angles. It wasn't written in any manual, but it spread through imitation, like fire through dry grass. Meanwhile, German intelligence took notice. Luftwaffe reports from July described highly maneuverable American escorts with unpredictable group discipline. They were baffled. Accustomed to predictable formation behavior, they now faced opponents who moved with both unity and individuality, an impossible combination. One report from Jagdgeschwader 27 called it Tanzende Schatten, dancing shadows, because the red-tailed planes seemed to appear and vanish in chaotic rhythm, never where logic said they should be. But as the Allies advanced north through Italy, internal politics grew harsher. The more successful the Red Tails became, the more certain officers in higher command sought to control the narrative. Credit was diverted to tactical adjustments by headquarters staff. Hall's reports were quietly redacted. When Davis recommended him for another citation, the paperwork disappeared en route to Washington. The message was clear. A black pilot who had broken orders could not be the face of innovation. Hall didn't care about medals. What haunted him were the men he couldn't save before he'd learned to fight his way. He remembered their faces. Lieutenant Roscoe Halliday, 23 from Baltimore, shot down in February when they were ordered to stay with the bombers. Sergeant Julian Price, gunner on Sweet Betsy, burned alive after a formation break was denied. He flew for them now, not for recognition. Each sortie was an act of remembrance, and each victory, a defiance of the silence that buried their names. By autumn, his legend was undeniable. His squadron had the highest escort survival rate in the 15th Air Force. Pilots began adapting his methods across Europe, often without even realizing where the idea had started. Hall flew 72 missions before a piece of flak tore through Duchess's left wing and forced him to bail out over the Apennines. He survived the crash, barely, and spent 3 days behind enemy lines before partisans found him. When he returned to base, limping and hollow-eyed, he was told he'd been listed as missing in action. "Guess I wasn't ready to be missing yet," he said dryly, and limped toward the hangar. After the war, when the Red Tails were finally deactivated, Hall was offered a teaching post at Tuskegee. He accepted quietly. There, among the next generation of pilots, he began to pass down the techniques that had once been forbidden: dogfighting at low altitude, dynamic escort coverage, decentralized initiative. His students nicknamed him the Shadow Captain for his habit of appearing behind them mid-air without warning, correcting their maneuvers over the radio in that steady, low voice. Don't chase the tail, anticipate the turn. The sky rewards thinkers. Decades later, when historians traced the roots of modern energy maneuverability theory, the framework used by jet fighter pilots in Korea and Vietnam, they found fragments of Hall's teaching buried in training notes. His methods had quietly migrated upward, reshaped by men who never knew his name. But the truth remained, preserved in logbooks, personal letters, and the memory of those who had flown under him. That one pilot, denied glory, had disobeyed an order, and in doing so, freed every pilot who came after him to think faster, fight smarter, and survive longer. And somewhere deep inside the archives of the Air Force Historical Research Agency, there still lies an unsigned note attached to a declassified report from 1944. Written in blue pencil, it reads only, "Doctrine must never outlive the men who die following it." A note, historians suspect, in Davis's own hand, written the day after Hall saved the bombers over Linz. Each morning, Hall walked out to the small airstrip at Tuskegee with a thermos of black coffee and a notebook tucked under his arm. The sun over Alabama was nothing like the light of Europe. It was thick, unrelenting, and full of the sound of cicadas instead of engines. Yet every time a student's propeller kicked to life, that familiar vibration traveled through the ground into his bones, and for a brief moment he was back in his Mustang, the world trembling under the wings of something greater than fear. His students adored him. They said he didn't teach them how to fly. He taught them why to fly. He rarely spoke of combat, but sometimes after long afternoons when the air shimmered with heat, he would take a student aside and tell a story that always began the same way. The hardest part isn't learning to fight, it's learning when not to. He never mentioned Ploiești or Linz by name, but those who listened closely could hear the ghosts in his pauses. They could sense the weight of decisions that no manual had ever covered. He taught them that altitude was time, speed was life, and obedience was a tool, not a chain. In 1949, the Air Force officially desegregated. It was a quiet revolution, signed in ink, but sealed by the blood and brilliance of men who had refused to fail. Hall watched from the crowd as Benjamin O. Davis Jr. addressed the new integrated command. Their eyes met briefly across the ceremony. Davis's salute was subtle, private, but the message was clear. You were right when it mattered most. But history, as always, moved faster than justice. The Red Tails were disbanded, their records dispersed. Hall's contributions disappeared into the vast filing cabinets of the Pentagon. He never published his combat notes, though a few pages survived. Sketches of interception angles, diagrams of pursuit curves, and the outline of a maneuver labeled simply adaptive escort. When a visiting colonel once asked why he hadn't tried to patent his method or claim credit, Hall smiled faintly and said, "You can't patent survival. You just hope someone remembers why it worked." In the late 1950s, he moved to Ohio to work for a small aviation company testing early jet trainers. The world had gone supersonic, but the lessons were the same. He was older now, slower to climb ladders, but his eyes still tracked the sky like a man reading an old language. Younger engineers came to his desk seeking advice on airflow, on dogfight geometry, on human instinct. He told them stories of mistakes and courage, never names or dates. They thought he was just a retired test pilot. None of them knew they were talking to the man whose defiance had shaped the tactics every jet in the world now used. When he passed away in 1971, his funeral was small. A simple flag draped his coffin, folded neatly into the hands of his widow, Eleanor. Only a few former Red Tails attended, men whose hair had grayed, whose eyes still carried the reflection of burning skies. They spoke softly about the missions no one had written down, about the day a captain from Alabama had broken formation and saved them all. There was no band, no general's eulogy, no cameras, just wind, the sound of it through the trees, like distant engines fading into memory. But legacies, like contrails, linger long after the noise is gone. Decades later, when the Air Force Academy studied the evolution of aerial combat tactics, analysts traced the first recorded deviation from rigid escort patterns to May 1944. Mission 112 over Ploiești. The name beside it, Captain Charles B. Hall. The footnote read, "Tactical innovation resulting from unauthorized maneuver. Outcome, reduced bomber losses. Recommendation, incorporate flexible escort doctrine." That single line, once buried in a forgotten report, became a cornerstone of modern air combat training. Every fighter pilot who now takes off knowing they have the authority to act, to improvise, to trust their instincts in the chaos of battle, every one of them is flying in the wake of Hall's defiance. In 1998, long after his death, a retired colonel named James McKendry, one of Hall's former students, petitioned the Air Force to recognize his instructor's contribution. It took 4 more years, but in 2002, Charles Buster Hall was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor for acts of extraordinary heroism in aerial combat and development of advanced escort tactics. His surviving family accepted it in a ceremony at the National Museum of the United States Air Force. A restored P-51B stood behind the podium, its red tail gleaming under the museum lights. On its nose, in careful white script, was painted a name, Duchess of the Sky. When the band played taps, the crowd stood silent. Among them were pilots from generations that had never known segregation, men and women who flew jets faster than sound, who had never had to disobey to be believed. They bowed their heads, unaware that the pattern of their flight paths, the freedom in their training, the autonomy in their orders, all traced back to a young man who once decided that obedience without thought was not loyalty, but surrender. Somewhere, perhaps above the museum's roof, a gust of wind rattled through the metal rafters, sounding almost like an engine turning over. Maybe it was imagination, or maybe, just for a heartbeat, the sky itself remembered. Because courage, real courage, isn't loud. It doesn't come with medals or parades. It comes in a single breathless instant when a man sees the world dying before his eyes and decides that rules are not sacred, lives are. Captain Charles Buster Hall broke formation once. And in doing so, he taught humanity how to fly free forever.